Well, Kim, thanks for joining me and helping me with my project Countdown to the Moon. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Ken Ruffin. I'm the president of the National Space Society of North Texas. That's one of dozens of chapters that are located, National Space Society chapters located across the United States and around the world. And just like your chapter, if it's okay for me to say that, your North Houston chapter, we uh, inform the public about what I call the latest information in space travel and space development. And we advocate for a variety of space missions, whether it's through NASA or whether it's through the commercial spaceflight companies and the plans that they have.
Yeah, and what got you involved in that?
I've loved space and been passionate about space since I was only 8 years old. I started off being a Star Trek fan slash fanatic as an 8-year-old. And immediately, even though, of course, that's science fiction, I was watching the original Star Trek series, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, Nichelle Nichols and company. And, watching them going to different planets in most of the episodes, different planets around different stars, it made me wonder, are there really any planets around other stars? Now, keep in mind, this was way, way back, so to speak, in the year 1974. No extrasolar planets had been discovered in 1974. So, to make a long story short, I finally found one of the teachers in my elementary school who was knowledgeable enough about space to say, no, we haven't uh, discovered any other planets around other stars, so whatever planets Kirk and Scotty and so forth were landing on and the Enterprise was orbiting, those were all science fiction. And as a matter of fact, we haven't even been to planets in our own solar system. So immediately that, in cartoons, how you see the light bulb come on over someone's head. So I got the idea at that moment. When I grow up, I will start my own company to design and build spacecraft so that we can get to these, not just, well, eventually to extrasolar planets and to discover whether or not they exist, but certainly to get to planets in our own solar system. I was like, I know I can get us to Mars. Um, Fast forward from age 8 to my being a junior in college, majoring in aerospace engineering at NC State University, go Wolfpack. And unfortunately, during my junior year, that's when January 28th, 1986 happened, and the Space Shuttle Challenger went kaboom. So I changed my major because of that incident. And so now I'm not working in the aerospace industry, have not started an aerospace company, certainly not a billionaire. However, I never lost my passion for space travel, and I'm certainly enthusiastic about the the the, um, the progress that the commercial spaceflight companies are making, as well as the current plans that NASA has for getting to the moon and beyond, or I should say, back to the moon and beyond.
I should make a connection about that January event in 1986 and a personal event in 1985. I actually went to the Kennedy Space Center in 1985 in December for the first time. I was 10 years
Okay,
old. And we got to
cool.
see Challenger was all ready to go. And then, in January, they had that event.
Yeah. So you actually saw a shuttle long before I ever saw an actual shuttle, being at Kennedy Space Center. My first and only time going to a launch was in 2010. The year 2010, it was STS 132. It was the fourth from the last shuttle launch. So my wife and I attended that, and we're we did not attend the launch last week of the SpaceX rocket, but we are looking forward to um, the list of different launches that are yet to come. Just a matter of picking and choosing uh, which one makes the most sense for us to attend, and keep our fingers crossed that it'll actually launch on schedule.
Indeed. And I didn't see the launch last week either, but I did see the launch attempt. Um, Tuesday afternoon, my youngest son and I decided to drive down to Florida. We
Oh,
saw the launch, but the weather on the weekend looked to be worse, and we couldn't stay through next week. So we came back on Friday.
wow,
I was
a
like,
day early.
I know.
Yeah, it happens. You know, it's you know, no matter how much weather forecasting has improved between now and decades ago, it's still not an exact science. So it's understandable. I was saying and thinking to myself, you know, on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, it's like, well, the forecast for the weekend isn't any better than it was Wednesday. So yeah, it's understandable.
So this project of mine, I wanted to get out there and talk to a wide group of people about their views on space in the context of us going back to the moon in 2024. And the first question I ask people is, did you know that we're planning to go back to the moon in 2024? And the vast majority of people say, no, they actually didn't know that.
Yeah,
Um,
I get that a lot too.
when did you find out about it?
When the announcement was made, let me see, it was like the vice president made the announcement, which, to make a long story short, the timeline for NASA sending people back to the moon was changed from 2028 to 2024. And I believe the announcement was made April of last year. I don't remember the exact date anymore. Shame on me. But for a while there, I could, you know, recite the exact date that the announcement was made.
And, people talk about one of the benefits of us going back to the moon is it would inspire people to explore, go into space, think about, expanding uh, humanity beyond just the Earth, expanding, be able to make use of the resources in space.
Mhm.
But it seems like it's really difficult for something to inspire if people don't know about it. And
Definitely.
I think in today's the way that we consume news today, it's unlike it was in 1969, where we had three broadcast television stations. We had, one or two papers per city. We had just a couple of periodicals, and it was literally in all those media.
Hmm.
Now we consume news, and it's personalized to our interest or to what it thinks our interests are.
Hmm.
And if you're interested in space, your news is flooded with space stuff. If
Right.
you're not, you won't ever see it.
Hmm. And I don't want to interrupt, but I
Oh,
just
please.
want to just amend what you said a little. What you said is 100% correct. But in addition to there being, you know, very few sources of news then compared to now, the primary difference between 1969 and 2020, as far as the general public's perception or attitude of space travel, is at the time the US was involved in something called the space race. And, you know, now the term is thrown around so loosely that, you know, it's actually often used in a completely different context now than it was then. Now it's, you know, there are these unofficial statements about a space race between companies and NASA, you know, which really dilutes the original meaning and value of that term. In 1969, there was a Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, or at the time, yeah, at the time, the Soviet Union, now Russia. At that time, it was U.S. versus the Soviet Union in a non-military technological competition. It was democracy versus communism, and most of the general public, especially leading up to Apollo 11, you know, the launch which resulted in the first moon landing, most of the general public in the US was really enthusiastic about beating the Soviet Union to the moon. Prior to July 20th, 1969, the Soviet Union had beaten the US to just about every other imaginable space related goal. So, if there was a scorecard, so to speak, the US was way behind the Soviet Union space program. So, that historic moon landing, the first historic moon landing, gave us the opportunity to say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, we have what was considered superior technology. We're able to get people to the moon and back, and to this day, only NASA, as the space agency of the United States, only NASA has accomplished that so far. So it was a matter of national pride to an extreme. So that's again, it's a night and day different situation from what's going on. Um, Whether it's 50 years later, last year in 2019, and certainly now, there's some things that we've heard about in the news. Some little thing called the coronavirus. You know, that's unfortunately, and I'm laughing not because it's funny, but um, it's just amazing how huge an impact that the coronavirus pandemic has had on the world. The number of people, the millions of people sick, the um, hundreds of thousands of people who've died. And then, of course, there are literally riots in the streets, peaceful protests, mostly peaceful protests, whether or not the news focuses on riots. So there are lots of things uh, that are taking up a lot of the public's attention and imagination these days, and it's unfortunate for a number of reasons, and especially from a space perspective, it just puts space travel, getting back to the moon, that much further out of the general public's attention, but it doesn't make it any less important.
And I've talked to a number of people, the vast majority of which are positive about us going to the moon and into space. But it's more of that kind of uncritical, uninformed positive, like just kind of reflecting my own kind of enthusiasm back at me type of a positive type thing. But there have been
I get it.
and there have been a few people that have not been positive about it. And I was expecting, sort of that opportunity cost issue. How could we be justifying spending resources on going to the moon when we have the poor, when we have people with health issues, when we have issues down, environmental issues and things like that. And um, I was wondering how you kind of approach that question.
Excellent question, and yeah, many people have asked me about that through not just the last 10 years that I've been a member of the National Space Society, but just through the decades. Um, there are so many problems on Earth. Why should we put money into space? In so many words. Well, first of all, there's no money being spent in space. No one's going to space with a checkbook or a debit card or credit card or anything like that. All the money pertaining to space is being spent on Earth. So I say that just to clarify where the money is being spent for products and services here on Earth. Now, as far as the purpose of those products and services, long term, not, I mean, from a short term aspect or short term perspective, especially with the different issues you've discussed and I've discussed, the different challenges that society is going through now. Why look even why consider space, whether it's short term or long term? Well, from a long term perspective, everyone's heard the expression, never put all your eggs in one basket. And humanity is in one basket. Humanity is in this one basket we call the Earth. So if something, I used to say catastrophic, but that was like from a 2019 perspective. In 2020, if something even more catastrophic than what's been happening in the past several weeks and months were to happen, something that made it extremely difficult, even more extremely difficult for life to exist here on Earth's surface, what would humanity do? Would we go extinct? Would we suffer the fate of the dinosaurs? Or if humanity has settlements in other locations on or beneath the surface of the moon, on or beneath the surface of Mars, uh, as the two initial destinations that everyone's familiar with. I could go on and talk about space settlements, but let's talk about locations that currently exist. So having humanity in more than one location just greatly increases the likelihood that humanity will continue to exist no matter how bad a catastrophe there is that might happen to Earth. Now, of course, somebody might say, well, it could be a catastrophe on Mars. It could be a catastrophe on the moon. Absolutely. Well, if people are on the Earth and on the moon, et cetera, then if there's a catastrophe in one of those places, a global catastrophe, whether it's moon global or not, then humanity will still exist somewhere else. So it's we look from a long-term perspective. The money is being spent from a long-term perspective in order to ensure the survival of the human race.
So I want to keep an eye on the time. I'm flexible. I don't have anything after this, so I could literally talk the rest of the day. But uh, how much time do you have?
Um, I'll actually have to get back to my day job, unfortunately, after the interview's over. I mean, I can certainly put in the 30 minutes, that we discussed. But beyond that, if you like, we could set up another interview. I mean, and I appreciate you saying you could, talk to me about this all day. Well, I could talk to you about this all day. I could talk about this all day to to anyone who's interested. So, to actually have someone that contacted me, asking about having this interview. I mean, this is great. I appreciate it. So, yeah, if you'd like to schedule a follow-up interview at some point, yeah, let's do that.
That's awesome. So what do you think? What do you think needs to be done to make the 2024 landing on the moon actually happen?
Hmm. It's a very simple yet complicated answer to that. The bottom line is funding for NASA comes from Congress, not from the White House, not from NASA itself, not from the general public, people who support space so much that they might want to make donations to NASA. And I've been asked about that. And I've always said, well, I don't work for NASA, but thank you on behalf of them anyway. And instead of sending money to NASA, why not contact your senators, contact your U.S. Congressional representative, and encourage them to increase funding for NASA or vote to increase NASA's funding. So yeah, it comes down to convincing those members of the Senate and the House that this should be a priority, should be, despite everything else that's going on, this should still be a priority from an inspirational standpoint, from a technological standpoint, and as I've mentioned, from a survival of humanity standpoint. We should make this a priority regardless. And if Congress will provide NASA the funding to do this, even though NASA is working in conjunction with commercial spaceflight companies, well, those commercial spaceflight companies are expecting some of that, some of their revenue to come from NASA. So it starts with Congress.
Mm, in terms of like what Elon's doing with the Starship down there in Boca Chica, there's that Dear Moon project to send a group of artists around the moon in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think he's on track to actually do that?
From what I can tell, he is, even though I haven't seen or heard any updates specifically about the Dear Moon project in the last several months. Um, there have been, and if someone's not familiar with the style or the method of testing that SpaceX does, they might see it as, well, from a glass half empty perspective. SpaceX has had one failure after another in testing their Starship, um, in those test models of the Starship. Well, because they've, just to clarify, they've had explosions with four of their test versions of the Starship. What most people aren't aware of, and unfortunately, what I have not seen reported in the general news media, is that that's how SpaceX does their testing. You know, they intentionally, deliberately test their vehicles until they fail. And they do that after having calculated when they expect failure to occur. And then they actually test to see, well, does failure occur when it was predicted, or or does it, unfortunately, worst case, would it fail before it's predicted, or beyond where it's predicted? And before, beyond, that's based on pressures of the fuel, whether it's the fuel tanks, or I should say propellant tanks, whether it's the engines themselves, engine operation, whether it's thrust from the engine, just a wide variety of different factors. So everything with SpaceX testing, they push their components, they push their vehicles to their absolute limits and beyond, and then they compare when failure happened to when failure was predicted to happen. So this is a long answer to a short question, but um, because they have continued to make progress leading up to the failures that they've had, they've learned. There have been quite a few lessons learned, and the idea is have all these failures now in the early stages of testing, so that when the actual vehicle is built, the vehicles that will be used for the Blue Moon mission to go around the moon, the vehicles that will be used for landing on the moon after that, all of the failures would have already happened. They would have, figured out um, the what it takes for the vehicles to fail, what margins are appropriate to prevent the vehicles from failing. So based on all of that, I would, and not being a SpaceX employee either, I would anticipate, yeah, they are on track. They've had some spectacular looking and sounding failures. I'm sure they've learned a lot, and at some point there will be a successful test, maybe within the next month or so, where the vehicle, whichever serial number vehicle it is, SN number, will actually get off the ground and land successfully. So yeah, just looking forward to that.
And, the opportunity cost reason for not going to space is something I expected, but there was another reason that people brought up regularly, which I didn't expect, and that was essentially, it can be summed up as, we've messed up the Earth. Why should we mess up the moon too?
Okay. Um, I again, that example of a half empty glass versus half full, I tend to be a half full glass sort of person. Humanity has learned so much about how to, I'll say, undo many of the mistakes of the past. When fossil fuels began being burned on a large scale, whether it's with factories, whether it's with electric utilities, this is literally going back to the 1800s. No one was aware of climate change and, the various types of air pollutants and water pollutants that have definitely become an issue since then. So we've learned a lot more. Actually, in my day job, I mentioned that I'm not in the environment. I'm sorry, I'm not in the aerospace industry. I'm actually in the environmental industry. So from my experience in that industry, I can say that the water and the waters of the United States and the air quality of the United States, they're each much better now than they were when the EPA started back in 1970. At least that's when Congress came up with developed the acts which started the EPA because of environmental issues with air, with water, with solid waste, and so forth. So the air is so much cleaner than it was, believe it or not. And anyone who's interested is welcome to go to EPA.gov or do a Google search and just look at the charts comparing air quality in. You can go by specific metropolitan area, you can go nationwide, whatever your preference. And air quality, water quality, again, you name it. So as we know better, we do better. We being humanity, and we're not messing up the earth anywhere nearly as bad as we used to because we're so much more knowledgeable about what's been done wrong and the effects that it's had on the earth as well as on people. So we will take those lessons learned with us to the moon and beyond. And I don't believe we'll mess up the moon.
And me neither. And that the first time I heard that, it caught me off guard because in the absence of a biosphere, what is pollution? That's was kind of like the mental block I had.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we're right at the top of the hour. Is there any additional comments you'd like to say before we close the call?
Um, Again, thank you for inviting me to have this interview. I'm I'm optimistic still about about humanity getting to the moon, and specifically the first woman and the next man going to the moon. The timing of this interview, I think, is really great because on Saturday, with SpaceX successfully launching the two NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, that's a huge boost, I think, for commercial spaceflight in general and SpaceX in particular. So I think that will just give them that much more motivation to um, continue, their efforts in working hard, being successful, and accomplishing their goals, including, of course, getting humanity to the moon. And unless Elon Musk or Gwen Shotwell or anyone else says otherwise, they're still projecting, to my knowledge, 100 people at a time, 100 paying passengers to the moon and back. So, this is a very exciting, very interesting time to be alive and to be interested in space flight and space settlement. So, I'm looking forward to what's going to happen in the next 4 years. I can't wait.
Thank you so much, Ken. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I definitely look forward to talking again.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. And you have a great rest of your day too.